So welcome to Chapter 1. We'll be going through Chapter 1 of the Murach HTML and CSS textbook today. This is kind of introduction to web development, some of the tools, some of the different pieces that go into actually making websites. We'll talk a bit more about the code in Chapter 2, but at the moment we're more talking about the tooling and the different components that go into the actual process. So that's where we're going today. As far as objectives, by the end of this, we want you to be able to load a web page in a web browser. Should be able to mostly do that already. Maybe there's something new here, especially because you're now writing these web pages yourself. So there may be a few more steps, a step or two that you need to know about. We'll go through how to look at the source code for really any web page out there, whether it be a web page that you've written or a web page that somebody else has written on the internet, and look at that actually in your web browser. We'll talk about, we want you to be able to discuss the components of a web application, what goes in, what are the different pieces that are needed to make that application work. We'll talk a little bit about HTTP requests and responses, which is how we kind of send data back and forth between the application and the browser. We want you to be able to distinguish between the way a web server serves static pages, pages that don't change per se, versus dynamic web pages, which is more... Dynamic web pages falls more into what we'll do third semester. Our main focus this semester here is just going to be on the static web pages, but we want to kind of show you briefly what some of the difference there is, where that comes in. That at a very, very high level. So we'll also want to talk about what the purpose of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, how do we use those, how are they separate, why are they an important part of building websites. We'll talk briefly about how to deploy a website to the internet. It's not something we're going to do until a little bit later, more than likely, but briefly talk about the tools that you would use if you wanted to do that. So we'll also talk about the components, the pieces of an HTTP URL. When you actually type in an address into your address bar, what is that, what are the pieces of that? And that matters a lot when we're building websites, because we'll have to include those in our websites. Okay. We also want to then, towards the end, we'll talk about the main web development issues that arise, namely in terms of usability, compatibility, accessibility, search engine optimization, and responsive web design. So we'll cover those 5 things briefly, and we'll expand on those a little bit more as this semester goes on. Okay. So if we're looking at a basic kind of look at what is a web application, you've got this idea over on the top right. You have this idea of, the web server. The web server is what serves the web pages. It's what you actually connect to and get the actual content from. Okay, so that's where your content is hosted, and this is where our code that we write this semester is going to end up. It's going to end up on the web server. Okay, that's where we're going to host it. To get to that actual web server, you have to go through this cloud, this mythical cloud called the internet. In reality, this internet is a web of interconnected computers and routers and other network infrastructure that deals with all the networking that's needed to get you from point A to point B. So there's a lot going on here really in that middle, and if you were to say take the networking curriculum, it would be all about this stuff in between, right? But we're web developers, so really what we're going to focus on is what happens here and what happens at the end. And we really will largely ignore a lot of stuff that happens here in the middle, just simply because our focus is really more on the code and actually building the content and building the websites rather than so much the networking in between. So it is possible that, hey, your web server could be serving that website to a bunch of different devices, right? So some people that may be using your website might be on a desktop. Some people that are using your website might be using a tablet. Some might be using a smartphone. Ideally, we want to be able to build one website that works for all of those devices, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about responsive design and what does that mean. But that's the overall kind of thing to think about. You have all these devices and different devices, different sizes, styles, operating systems, browsers that might be connecting to your web server, but they're all going to be connecting somehow through the internet. Okay. Now, to expand on what that cloud looks like and then everything there, we could say, okay, well, over here in gray, this is our web server. You can kind of see these icons like this traditionally represent servers. So servers are anything that hosts resources that you can get to over some sort of network. Okay, so here's the server we're trying to get to, and all the way over here is your user. This is the person who wants to use your website. So they need to get through here. Now in here you can see, well, there's a lot of computers, right? The little monitors, each of those represents a computer. So you got servers and you've got computers. We also have in here things we call LANs, local area networks. They look like little clouds. And then we have, so all of your kind of at the lowest level, you see closest to the computer, there's always a LAN, a local area network. Okay, because those are our smallest, finest grained kind of networks. When we want to go out to the internet, we then go out to something called a WAN, wide area network. Okay, so wide area network groups together a bunch of smaller networks and then is in charge of kind of connecting them to each other. So for instance, if you say you have your internet through Charter, then the WAN that you're connecting to would be Charter's WAN. Or if you're connecting to AT&T, well, you're going to be connecting out to AT&T's WAN. Well, maybe let's say you're connecting out to AT&T is your service provider for getting out to the internet. Well, then you're connecting to their WAN, but maybe someone over here, maybe they're hosting this on Verizon's network, and maybe they're hosting it over in California, right? Well, so you're going to have to somehow get from your WAN, which is St. Louis and AT&T, over to Verizon's network in California. Well, to get there, we go through something called IXP. This is basically just a way to transfer things from one WAN to another WAN. So all of these things are really going on underneath the surface, and in some cases it can affect you, all these things that are kind of going on. But typically, we as software developers mostly concern us with the first mile, which is kind of here getting to the LAN, and then the last mile, which is from the LAN to the server. This is kind of our domain. Everything else in between these two LANs, the LAN at the end and the LAN at the beginning, that's the network engineers. They take care of that. And that's typically not something as a software developer that you ever have to touch. We do occasionally run into things like needing to deal with something called DNS as far as getting our websites hosted up. But for the most part, everything that kind of happens here in the middle, we can just treat that as a cloud, right? We don't really care. It doesn't necessarily affect us as long as the network engineers are doing their jobs. So our jobs here, our jobs there. Everything else is kind of in between. So let's go to the next one. So if we're looking at, say, maybe a static web page. So a static web page might look something like this. You've got your basic nav bar up at the top. You got a few different pages that you can look at information from. But the part that makes it really static is that there aren't things that the user can quote unquote do on this site, right? They can't create data. They're not writing articles. They're not necessarily submitting comments and things like that. There might be a contact us form, which would be a little bit more dynamic, but most of the contact here is fixed. It's static. It's just in a file somewhere, and when you go out to get that resource, it just says, okay, here's the file. I'll go send it to you. You're just downloading resources that have been already created, and it can use that same resource for all of the users that are looking at the website. So in a simple static website like this, the structure, the way that this communication, the way that you actually get to the resources kind of looks like this. So on the back end, we have files. Typically, you're going to start with just HTML files. We'll talk a little bit about what those are. But we'll have some files here that contain the actual content of the web page. Those are on the web server. So the web server will take those. We'll take the request that comes in from your browser. So you're using Chrome or Firefox or Safari. We'll take that request, we'll come in here and say, okay, I've got the request. Well, you want the home page. All right, so let me get the home page and I'll send it back to you. I'll send that file back to you. You want the maybe the About the Ranch page or cabins and rates. If you say I want About the Ranch, it'll go grab that, come back. You want guest response to go grab that. All right, come back. So really it's just saying, I want this file, and it comes back and gives you that file. That's all that really happens with static content. If we're building a more dynamic web page, which most of the web is quite a bit more dynamic, that's where we can't just say, well, we'll have all the files around and just serve them up. So for instance, if we think about Amazon's got millions of products. They can't just have a file for every single one of those products. That would be too expensive. It would take up too much space. It would be too hard to maintain. So rather than doing that, they use some more dynamic methods where when you ask for the information about that product, it dynamically creates that page. That page didn't exist before you asked for it, but probably, and then gives it back to you, right? So in this kind of setup, the client is connecting to the web server still, and it still sees HTML coming back. What's different is that on the back end, I'm not simply just serving up files. It's not simply just downloading a file that's on this computer, that's on this server. So what it will do instead is it'll go to the application server and say, okay, here's the request. You come up with a response. So we'll say, okay, all right. Well, for this page, you want information about this jQuery book. Well, I need to go to the database and get the information about that jQuery book, bring it back. I'll build up an HTML page from that with the information from the database and the code that's in the application server. It will send that back to the web server. So now the web server has an HTML file and it sends it back here, right? So, or an HTML document to maybe be more accurate. So what changes with a dynamic sort of website is you have this application server as well as the database servers typically behind your web server. Now, in a lot of more modern setups, especially with what we'll be talking about in third semester, this web server and the application server are actually the same thing usually. Usually they're not actually separate. Usually the application server and the web server are the same. But that's not necessarily true with all languages. Some languages have those, and some frameworks, as far as building dynamic websites, will separate those things. But some technologies do not treat those as separate items. So I want to take a little pause here to kind of give you a different view of some of these pieces from a different angle. So there's a few videos here that I'm going to put onto the playlist up next, and they'll kind of go over some of the things we've already talked about, but with some additional layers of depth and just explaining it in some different language. So hopefully that will be helpful. We'll pause here. I'll come back and resume the video after those after those sections.